You demand. I have come to destroy the house of Van Helsing, the old through the young. You, in your line, have been chosen. Good evening. I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house. This week we are doing another movie review. This is Dracula A.D. 1972. From the legendary Hammer Films, and of course the film was released in 1972. The film was directed by Alan Gibson and stars the legendary Christopher Lee in the role of me. The film also stars the legendary Peter Cushing in the role of Lorimer Van Helsing, as well as his grandfather Lawrence Van Helsing, who we see at the beginning. He is the grandfather of Lorimer, and he is the original Van Helsing we see in the film horror of Dracula. He has his final battle with the menace that is known as Count Dracula in epic grand fashion on top of the stagecoach at the beginning of the film, as the two men battle to the death on the stagecoach. The stagecoach crashes and the men fall to the bottom of the ground. Their bodies lie motionless. And then we find that Count Dracula has been impaled by the wooden wheel. The wooden spoke of the wheel goes into his heart. And of course, as Lawrence Van Helsing rises, he sees this and plunges the spoke all the way through his heart, killing Count Dracula, but not at the risk of his own life. Being battle-scarred and torn, Lawrence Van Helsing falls to his death. And as that happens, we meet a descendant of Dracula who just happens to be riding by on his horse, and he sees what happens with Dracula, and he then collects the sample of Dracula's blood. He puts it inside a blood capsule, and he takes the cape as well as Dracula's ring and leaves, and that is the beginning of the film. Awesome beginning, I must say. The film also stars the lovely Stephanie Beacham in the role of Jessica Van Helsing. Gorgeous, gorgeous woman. And what happens with Jessica Van Helsing is she's fallen in with the wrong crowd. Now, she is the granddaughter of Lorimer Van Helsing. And she gets in with the wrong crowd and goes to this wild party where this horrible, horrible music is playing by this band called Stoneground. Now, this music is kind of a wannabe Lynyrd Skynyrd, wannabe 70s classic rock, but it is so bad it threatens to destroy this film. That's how bad it is, because it goes on and on for about 15 minutes in the opening of the film. Fun fact is, they almost picked Rod Stewart to perform the music in the film. Can you imagine going back and seeing Rod Stewart in a Hammer Dracula film? How cool would that be? Would be awesome. But instead we got this horrible band that sounds like some stoner rock and sounds like they've never played in their life before this movie. It's so bad. But at any rate, the wonderful performances by Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, when those two come together, it's hammer gold. And we have that here in this film, very much so. We also have the talents of the lovely, the beautiful Caroline Munro, who makes her film debut here in Dracula A.D. 1972. And she is so gorgeous that if you look at her too long, you might melt away. She plays Laura Bellows in the film, a friend of Johnny Alucard, who is throwing the party. And young Johnny Alucard is a descendant of the man from the beginning of the film who got the blood, who captured the blood of Dracula. And he is a very driven young man. He is into the dark arts. He is into black magic, if you will. And he is looking to throw a black mass. And he has invited young Jessica Van Helsing, as well as her boyfriend, and Laura Bellows, played by Caroline Munro. So somehow young Johnny Alucard, who is very charismatic, very young, very handsome, and he lures them in to this cult madness inside this abandoned church where they perform the black rites, the black magic rituals of black mass. His evil plan is to conjure up the Prince of Darkness, Count Dracula, by way of black mass, similar to what we saw in Taste the Blood of Dracula. Here young Johnny Alucard takes the blood he collected from Count Dracula, dispenses it into this chalice. He then slits his wrist, and the blood pours into the chalice and rises up above the chalice and pours all over poor young Laura Bellows, again played by Caroline Munro. As the blood pours all over her body and all over her beautiful black dress, she begins to freak the hell out. And everyone freaks out, and they all leave this craziness, this madness behind, and leave Johnny Alucard there. And we see the smoke rising from the ground because Dracula's body lies in the grounds of that church, and we can still see that stake driven into his heart. But as the smoke rises, Johnny Alucard sees this and pulls the stake out from the ground, and we see the smoke rise, and we see Dracula has risen from the grave. So Dracula returns, seeking the blood of human victims to keep his youth and to keep his strength, as he plans to destroy the house of Van Helsing. And he uses young Johnny Alucard as his servant to do his bidding, to lure in these young beauties and bring the lambs to the slaughter, if you will, to Count Dracula to feed on. We then meet Lorimer Van Helsing, of course played brilliantly, as always, by the great Peter Cushing. And he has some of his best work in this film, absolutely. And Lorimer Van Helsing meets with this Inspector Murray, who's played by Michael Coles. Now, Michael Coles also reprises that role in the satanic rites of Dracula. And Inspector Murray, of course, finds the dead body of Laura Barrows, who's had the blood drained from her body, the blood drained completely. And of course she is murdered. And Laura Marr is very concerned that his granddaughter, Jessica Van Helsing, played by Stephanie Beacham, who is just gorgeous. And she does a great job in this role, I must say. And of course, he's concerned that young Jessica is mixed up in this cult craziness, this madness that ended up in the murder of Laura. And when she tries desperately to say her whereabouts of that evening, young Inspector Murray delves deeper into the cult insanity led by young Johnny Alucard. And in doing so, he questions Laura Marr Van Helsing, who is an expert on the occult, an expert on vampirism, and of course an expert on Count Dracula. He knows what's behind this madness. He knows that there is a vampire cult on the loose, and he knows that Dracula has returned, has risen from his grave, and is feeding on the blood of these young victims. And he has to stop him. Only Van Helsing can stop him. And of course that leads to an incredible final battle, an incredible climax that, as always, spoiler alert, ends in the death of Dracula, as it does in every Hammer Dracula film. But this film is particularly spectacular in the way that Dracula is disposed of, and it's magnificent. The film has a great gothic feel. It's got that classic Hammer flavor, as well as being updated for the 70s, for that time. The movie is, of course, of its time, absolutely. And it's very 70s, as you see in the clothes worn by Jessica and Caroline Munro, and of course everyone in the film. Except, of course, Count Dracula. Nothing changes about Count Dracula ever. He is eternal. With that being said, I do wish that the film had Dracula walking about the streets of London, terrorizing the city, taking full advantage of the fact that Dracula is now in modern times. The film keeps him relegated to that big Gothic church, and he pretty much stays there as Johnny Alucard leads the unsuspecting victims for Dracula to prey on. So pretty much the entire film, Dracula is relegated to that church. But no matter, because the performance of Christopher Lee says it all, and he is at his best here. He is just magnificent, with no matter how little dialogue he has, no matter how little scenes he has, no matter how little screen time he has, Christopher Lee owns the role of Count Dracula. Absolutely. And this film is no different, as is Peter Cushing. Once again, as Van Helsing, is absolutely amazing. You buy everything he says 100%. Absolutely phenomenal actor, and these two masters just carry this film. And I think it is a very worthy entry into the Hammer Dracula franchise. I know the film is quite maligned among the horror fans, but I disagree with that. I think if you give it a chance, you will find that this is an excellent Dracula film, despite the absolutely terrible music. With that being said, thank you for joining me, Count Dracula, in the Horror Corner.